Tonight, forget everything you think you know about medieval assassins. No, not the ones in sleek leather hoods leaping off rooftops into hay bales. Not the moody anti-heroes with tragic pasts and infinite throwing knives. We're talking about the real ones, the kind that crawled through muck, held their breath in wine cellars, and prayed the guards were too drunk to notice the guy behind the curtain with a knife. Because being a medieval assassin, it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, it definitely wasn't something you dreamed about while sharpening daggers by moonlight. It was what you became when the world had completely chewed you up and spit you out. But hey, before we crawl into the shadows, make sure to like the video and subscribe, unless you're watching this from a barrel in a castle moat, in which case you've got bigger problems, and drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Always wild seeing who's in the dark with us tonight. Dim the lights, maybe throw on a fan or some ambient thunder. Let's descend into a world of poverty, paranoia, and really questionable life choices. Let's get one thing straight. No one ever chose to be a medieval assassin. No kid with a wooden sword ever said, "Someday I want to poison a duke and hide in a goat pen for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like a dead-end detour you hit when everything else in life had gone horribly wrong. You weren't some mountaintop trained master of stealth. You were a desperate peasant, a disgraced soldier, a thief with nothing left but a grudge and a decent throwing arm. You were off the books, under the radar, and probably not even counted in the local census. If you had anything, a title, a plot of land, even a half-decent goat, you hired assassins. You didn't become one. But if you just escaped from debtor's prison, had the kind of face that blended into a crowd, and could pick a lock with a chicken bone, then congrats. Someone was about to slide a coin pouch across a tavern table and whisper a name. And that name? It was never Bob the candlemaker. It was always someone with power. A corrupt bishop. A noble with too many enemies and not enough sense. A baron surrounded by guards and moats and paranoia. The pay sounded good. 12 silver coins, maybe even 20. But by the time you considered it, you didn't care. Because you had no family, no future, no safety net. Just a hood, a weapon you probably stole, and a whole lot of existential dread. There were no perks, no health plan, no guild-issued dagger maintenance, no vacations. You couldn't hang a sign that said discreet eliminations, reasonable rates. Your job was to vanish into the night and never mention what you did for a living, especially not in a loud voice while drunk in an inn. Me? I sell rugs, bloodstains. Oh, that's, wine. So nobody wanted to be an assassin. They just ended up there like rats in a flooded cellar. The world didn't train you. It just kept trying to kill you until you learned how not to die. Let's shatter the next myth. There were no elite assassin schools hidden in temples, with monks and meditation and inspirational flute solos. You didn't get a mentor who taught you pressure points and poetic philosophy. Your first lesson was surviving the first job long enough to get a second. Most assassins weren't trained. They were just slightly more coordinated than average. Maybe you'd picked up some tricks in the army, how to stab without tripping over your own feet. Maybe a thief showed you how to move quietly without knocking over barrels. Maybe an old assassin gave you one tip before disappearing forever. If you had formal training, it was don't get caught and don't sneeze while climbing a drain pipe. You didn't get safety briefings. You didn't get a tour of noble homes with labels like secret exit and panic room. You learned by trial and error. Heavy on the error. Poison was guesswork. Herbs, minerals, maybe crushed toad guts. Sometimes it killed your target. Sometimes it made them throw up for an hour and cancel lunch. Sometimes you drank the wrong goblet and learned nothing because you were dead. There was no handbook, no assassin HR department, just instinct, desperation, and whatever scraps of advice you overheard in a tavern. Weapons? Let's talk gear. Fantasy lied to you. You didn't get hidden wrist blades or smoke bombs that vanished you into the air. Your tools were whatever didn't clang when you walked. A decent dagger was a luxury. You probably took it off a sleeping guard or bought it from someone who definitely didn't ask where you were going with it. Maybe you had a garrote if you were feeling fancy, maybe a rope, maybe just a rock and a plan. If your gear broke mid-job, you improvised. A broken tile, a rusted nail, a butter knife from the kitchen. Desperate times called for deeply regrettable weapon choices. You hid your tools in cloaks, boots, even inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. And your weapons, they weren't your friends. They were barely reliable. There were no upgrades, no magical steel. Just the hope that your dagger didn't snap the moment it hit bone. You didn't have options. You had one shot, one chance. No backups, no retrees. If you missed, the only upgrade you got was a personal introduction to the nearest executioner. You weren't getting paid to take out Jeff the drunkard who owed someone rent. No one risked assassination charges for petty revenge. You were going after someone important. The kind of person whose name made people lower their voice. Nobles, high-ranking clergy, military officers, sometimes even royalty. These people were not easy to kill. They were surrounded by guards. Not one or two, but whole squads of men trained to look suspiciously at everything. Their homes weren't houses. They were castles, literal fortresses with moats, walls, murder holes, and guards who'd stab you just for breathing too confidently near a gate. You had to spend days studying everything. Patrol schedules, how loudly each door creaked, whether the night guard had asthma and paused halfway up the stairs. You didn't just sneak in, you choreographed an entire performance. Silent, invisible, perfect. And that was just the beginning, because castles were designed to kill people like you. Cross the wrong hallway, arrows through the chest, take the wrong step, hello boiling oil, peek around the wrong corner, say hi to 3 guards and a very angry goose. And that's before you reach the servants. Yes, the unarmed, apron-wearing cooks and maids. They were more dangerous than the guards because they noticed things. They knew everyone's face. One unfamiliar glance, one wrong name for the cook's cat, and you'd be outed faster than you could say, "I'm just here to fix the chimney." You weren't just dodging swords, you were dodging gossip. And in medieval times, gossip was faster than fire and twice as deadly. Because the second someone whispered, "stranger," it turned into spy, then sorcerer, then stabby devil man from the woods, and suddenly you're running from a torch-wielding mob, and your target, the paranoid wreck you were hired to eliminate, they slept behind triple-locked doors in random rooms that changed every night. Some had food testers, others had body doubles, one even had a moat inside his castle. You didn't catch these people by accident. You needed skill, timing, or divine intervention. And no, you didn't get to rest once they left the castle for a feast. You had to blend in with drunks, jugglers, dogs, jesters, and a dozen guards pretending not to be drunk. You had to be sober, focused, and ready to strike while holding a wine goblet and pretending to enjoy the world's worst loot solo. Just getting close could take weeks. Maybe you bribed a maid, maybe you posed as a chimney sweep or a mute stable hand. But when the moment came, when the room was finally empty and the target alone, you had one chance, one clean strike, no mess, no screams, no witnesses. You had to vanish before the body hit the floor. Otherwise, you didn't just fail, you became a warning. Because failure wasn't a performance review. It was a slow, agonizing death tied to something with spikes. You messed up and you got to be the body they hung from the castle gate with a sign that said, "Nice try." Even if the guards didn't catch you, your client might. See, when someone hires an assassin, they don't want a partnership, they want a transaction. Quick, clean, no loose ends. And you, with your witness eyes and messy memories, you were the loosest end of all. The usual promise was half the silver up front, half after the job. That's if your client was generous or stupid. More often, they just didn't plan to pay. They ghosted. Or worse, they sent someone to eliminate you. Because why pay 12 silver when a knife to your ribs was free? And even if they did pay, it was never enough. Not for the bruises, not for the 3 days you spent pretending to be a statue in a wine cellar, not for the fact that your own reflection scared you now. Oh, and sometimes, the job was a trap, a decoy, a setup. You'd be told to kill some minor noble, only to find the room full of guards with crossbows and a scroll with your name already written on it. Surprise! It's an execution rehearsal and you're the guest of dishonor. And who do you complain to? There's no assassins' union, no small claims court for shady barons who didn't honor their blood money deal. You couldn't exactly storm into court and say, "Your Honor, I was unjustly cheated for the murder of Lord Bramblefist." So you learned fast. Always demand payment up front. Trust no one. Especially not that greasy scribe who promised a clean job, no drama, in and out. Because you were the drama. And the only clean thing about the job was the part where they cleaned up your body. And that's assuming you survived the job at all. Let's talk disguises. Forget hooded elegance or billowing cloaks that caught moonlight just right. You looked like a sick beggar with something to hide. That was the goal. To blend in. To disappear into the crowd of hobbling, unwashed peasants. Your outfit? Peasant rags. Maybe a monk's robe 2 sizes too big. A guard's uniform stolen from a corpse. If you had a mask, it was probably just a rag that made you look like a contagious leper, which worked unless you were trying to get into a party. If someone asked who you were, you had to improvise. Brother Tobias, I clean gutters for God convincing? Not really. But better than assassin here to rearrange your master's ribcage. And even if the disguise worked, that was just the start. Now you had to stay in character for hours, pretend you belonged, know the castle layout, know the names of people you've never met. Wait, which staircase leads to the jester's quarters? And you were done. There were no wigs, no makeup. If you needed to look older, you rubbed dirt on your face and hoped for the best. You were always one stammer away from disaster. Disguises didn't keep you safe. They just bought you 5 minutes of confusion. After that, it was either escape or stab your way out while pretending to be a laundry boy with anger issues. And the real kicker? You had no team, no mentor in a secret hideout, no alchemist handing you potions, no buddy with a crossbow covering your escape. You had you, just you, and your weapon, and your wildly unreliable instincts. No allies, no reinforcements, not even other assassins. Because if you met one, you ran the other way. Why? Because if they knew your face, they were a liability. If you knew theirs, same deal. No one wanted to risk their neck on assassin LinkedIn. Even criminals avoided you. Thieves had drinking buddies, smugglers had contacts. You were the guy everyone pretended not to see. Because you weren't just lonely. You were dangerous. And danger was bad for business. You didn't have a home. You didn't stay in one place long enough to get mail. Inns, one night, corner table, back to the wall. You never drank too much, never gave your name. You couldn't afford to, because in your line of work, comfort was the most fatal feeling of all. Before Cleopatra, before Boudica, there was Olympias, a woman who didn't just navigate the cutthroat politics of ancient empires. She sharpened the knives. She wasn't the kind of queen who smiled politely and waved from balconies. She was the kind who whispered in oracles, walked with snakes, and slept, knowing that power was always earned in blood. She was born into royalty, yes, but not the kind of royalty that handed you silk cushions and gentle praise. She was a Molossian princess from Epirus, rugged mountain lands where ruling families were less pampered elite and more wolf pack with crowns. If you wanted to survive, you didn't learn court etiquette, you learned how to bite first. Her real name wasn't even Olympias. She was born Polyxena, then called Myrtale. The name Olympias came later, after one of her husband's victories, because in those days, nothing said "I love you" like renaming your wife after a sporting event. But the truth is, Olympias didn't belong to anyone. She wasn't content to be a wife. She wanted influence. She wanted legacy. She wanted to shape the future of empires with her own hands, and she didn't care how many kings, generals, or snakes she had to charm to get there. Which brings us to the snake thing, and no, seriously, Olympias had pet snakes. Not the metaphorical kind. Actual, hissing, slithering serpents that she let curl around her arms, her hair and, according to legend, her bed. Some said it was religious, part of her devotion to Dionysus or some ancient cult. Others said it was psychological warfare. Because imagine being a Macedonian nobleman, already uneasy around powerful women, and then finding out the queen shares her bedroom with a python named Destiny. That's not just unsettling. That's empire-shaking nightmare fuel. And that's how Olympias liked it. She cultivated fear the way other queens cultivated roses. When she married Philip II of Macedon, it wasn't exactly a love story. Philip was a brawler king. Brilliant, violent, unpredictable. Olympias, equally brilliant, equally unpredictable. Theirs was a political match. Two predators agreeing to not eat each other for the sake of power. At first things were fine. Macedon was rising, Philip was conquering, Olympias was securing her place at court, but then came the child. Not just any child, Alexander. From the moment he was born, Olympias didn't just raise him, she forged him. She whispered gods into his ears, told him he was descended from Achilles, trained him to believe his blood wasn't red. It was divine. She didn't want a son. She wanted a legend. And Alexander believed her, but Philip? Not so much. As Alexander grew, Philip started getting nervous. Too smart, too ambitious, too influenced by his mother. The distance grew, both politically and personally. Philip remarried. Olympia seethed. Suddenly her son's claim to the throne wasn't ironclad. And Olympias didn't do uncertainty. She didn't scream, she didn't argue, she waited. Every dinner became a chess game, every whisper in the hallway a potential dagger. Olympias wove webs around servants, advisors, generals. She had allies in places Philip didn't even know existed. And then, one day, Philip was dead. Assassinated during a public ceremony, stabbed by one of his own guards. Conspiracy theories exploded. Maybe it was personal revenge, maybe a rival general, but a lot of fingers pointed toward Olympias. She never confessed, never gloated, but she didn't grieve much either. And what did she do next? She had Philip's other wife burned alive. Then she executed her baby, a royal infant, thrown into a fire to clear Alexander's path to the throne. This wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. She was sending a message. There will be no rivals, only one king, only one mother of that king. Olympias had sculpted Alexander's future with blood and fear, and now it was time to see what he would do with it. When Alexander took the throne, he wasn't just the king of Macedon. He was the sharp end of a spear pointed at the known world. But behind him, just out of view, stood Olympias, watching, whispering, calculating. She didn't ride into battle. She didn't hold the sword. But her fingerprints were on every war map, every strategy, every public gesture that made Alexander seem more than mortal. Because Olympias didn't just want her son to rule. She wanted him to transcend. She made sure the people knew about his divine bloodline, how he was descended from Achilles, maybe even Zeus himself. She helped forge the mythos of Alexander the Great, a man so powerful cities surrendered at the sound of his name, so brilliant even his enemies called him unstoppable. But she knew what kind of world he was walking into. She knew power never went unchallenged. So while Alexander was marching across Persia, Egypt and India, Olympias remained back home, not as a grieving widow or passive queen mother, but as a player, a strategist, a shadow monarch. She maintained alliances, watched the nobles, and kept knives pointed in the right directions. No rebellion could take root without her feeling it in the soil. No whisper of treason escaped her ears. While her son was conquering the edges of the map, she was holding the centre together with sheer force of will. But empires don't just rise, they crack, and when Alexander died, young, feverish and without a clear heir, the cracks exploded. Olympias had lost her son, but she hadn't lost her ambition. What followed was a massacre disguised as succession. Alexander left behind a power vacuum, and the generals who once kissed his boots now sharpened their blades against each other. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant. The child, if a boy, could rule. But the world didn't run on ifs. It ran on armies. Olympias saw it coming. She took her grandson, Alexander IV, and declared him the rightful king. A child. A symbol. But she would be the regent, the real power. Not just mother of the conqueror, but grandmother of the future. Others disagreed. Cassander, son of Antipater, hated her influence, hated how she twisted the court to her will, hated how people still flinched at her name. He believed the empire belonged to the generals, not to some aging queen with a taste for blood. So he declared war, and Olympias didn't back down. Even in her 60s, she outmaneuvered younger, stronger men. She raised armies, she negotiated with governors, she had entire cities flip allegiance because they feared her more than any army. At one point she seized control of Macedon itself, ordered the execution of Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, and hundreds of his supporters. It wasn't subtle, it was a purge, a warning carved into marble and soaked in royal blood. Olympia still ruled here, but war favours the persistent, and Cassander. He didn't give up. He besieged her, starved her, waited her out like a jackal circling a lioness. Eventually her supporters, tired, hungry, frightened, betrayed her. They opened the gates. Cassander captured Olympias, and, for a brief moment, the world held its breath. What would he do? She'd burned his family line, humiliated his allies, waged war against everything he stood for. This was his revenge served cold on a throne of corpses. He put her on trial. It was a sham, a performance. Olympias refused to beg. refused to cry, refused to pretend she was anything other than what she'd always been. A queen who built empires and broke bones with equal grace. The court sentenced her to death, but Cassander didn't want his men to kill her. Too risky. They still feared her, respected her, maybe even loved her. So he left it to the families of her victims, the ones she had executed. Let them do the dirty work. At first they hesitated. Even then, even broken, unarmed and facing death, Olympias radiated something primal, something ancient, like a forgotten goddess who might still smite you with her last breath. But eventually stones flew. She was stoned to death in public. No grand farewell, no final speech, just silence, then violence, a queen to the end. You walk through the crumbling halls of Knossos, and for a moment you forget time. The stones are warm under your feet. The air smells like dust, salt, and secrets. And you think to yourself, this doesn't feel like Greece. It doesn't even feel like history. It feels like a dream someone buried. Because Knossos isn't like the other ancient cities. It doesn't rise from the earth like Rome. It doesn't stand in defiance like Sparta. It unfolds. It's a place of curves, not corners, ramps, not stairs, open courts, skylights, air shafts, all designed not for defence but for elegance. While other Bronze Age civilizations built walls and towers, the Minoans built flow. They didn't want a fortress. They wanted a palace that breathed. And what a palace! At its height, Knossos sprawled across 6 acres, over 1,000 rooms, multiple levels, storage chambers, ceremonial halls, and vibrant murals that still cling to the walls like ghosts in colour. No throne rooms with iron and skulls, just frescoes of dolphins, acrobats, lilies, and of course, bulls. Always the bulls. They leap across walls, they dance with humans, they sit at the centre of a myth that has outlived entire civilizations. Because here's where history blurs into legend. Knossos is the beating heart of the Minotaur myth. You know the one, half man, half bull, trapped in a labyrinth, fed a steady diet of terrified Athenian youths until Theseus showed up with a ball of string and a sword. A monster in a maze. But here's the twist. The real maze. It wasn't underground, it was above. The Palace of Knossos was so complex, so confusing, so twisted in its architecture that ancient visitors must have genuinely believed it was a labyrinth. Hallways that led to nowhere, stairs that stopped at the ceiling, rooms that looped back on themselves. You didn't need a monster. The palace was the monster. And what about the bull? Bulls were sacred to the Minoans. They weren't just animals, they were symbols. Power, fertility, divine rhythm. The bull-leaping frescoes. Let's talk about the worst job in ancient Rome. No, not the gladiators, not the sewer cleaners, not the guy who had to scrape vomit off marble banquet floors at midnight. We're talking about the Auriga, a chariot racer. Sounds cool, right? Thunderous applause, gold medals, heroic statues. Yeah. Until you realise the job description was basically drive a murder cart through a death loop at 40 miles an hour while everyone around you tries to kill you with horses. Because Roman chariot racing, it wasn't just a sport. It was a blood-soaked, spine-snapping, wheel-shattering spectacle where the only rule was, don't die too early. Imagine a racetrack bigger than a football stadium packed with 200,000 people, all screaming for your destruction. The Circus Maximus, the biggest arena in ancient Rome, bigger than the Colosseum, louder than a thunderstorm in a tin warehouse, more dangerous than any battlefield. Each race, 7 laps, 1,200 metres per lap. which doesn't sound like much, until you remember those laps included turns so sharp they made modern racetracks look like gentle hills. The curves were the killers. They were called meti, stone pillars around which racers had to whip their chariots like lunatics playing tag with death. Take it too wide, you lose. Take it too tight, you crash. Hit it directly? Hope your soul had travel insurance, and you weren't alone. You were racing against 3, 4, sometimes 11 other chariots, each one driven by a man just as desperate, just as reckless, just as hyped up on fame, adrenaline, and possibly questionable herbs. They drove with reins wrapped around their waists. Yes, waists. So they could steer with their entire bodies, which also meant, if they crashed, they didn't just fall out, they got dragged. Behind panicking horses, across sand, wood, bone, and whatever used to be the last guy. That's why Auriga carried a knife, not for enemies, for themselves, so they could cut the reins before being turned into track seasoning. And the crowd, they loved it. They didn't cheer for safety, they roared for crashes. The bigger, the better. Flips, explosions, horse piles, bodies under wheels. It was NASCAR meets Game of Thrones meets Ancient Demolition Derby. But here's the kicker. If you survived, you could become rich. Some Auriga earned more than top generals, more than senators. The superstar Gaius Apuleius Diocles reportedly raked in 35 million sesterces in his career, enough to buy an army. Or 5? But to get there, you had to live, and most didn't. Most were slaves, trained from childhood, treated like expendable celebrities. If you were lucky, your fame could buy your freedom. If not, your bones became part of the racetrack. The colours? Oh, the teams. Red, blue, green, white. Fans went harder for them than modern football ultras. People rioted, killed, and bet fortunes based on which colour hit the finish line first. Even emperors had favourites. Nero drove in races himself. Badly. Caligula tried to bribe charioteers like they were gods. Justinian nearly lost his empire when the blues and greens turned a rivalry into the Nika riots, burning half of Constantinople to the ground. Because chariot racing wasn't just a sport, it was religion, it was politics, it was class warfare wrapped in horsepower and sandstorms, and in the middle of it all, one poor guy holding 4 reins, whispering prayers, and hoping today wasn't the day he became a stain on history. Let's talk about plague doctors. You know the look. Long black cloak, cane in one hand, beak mask that screams, "I definitely haunt dreams." They show up in Halloween costumes, memes, steampunk festivals. People assume they were some kind of medieval Batman. Wise, mysterious, immune to death. Yeah. No, being a plague doctor was less cool vigilante and more last person you saw before your organs liquefied. Let's start with the outfit. That infamous mask. The beak wasn't for drama. It was basically a 17th century gas mask, stuffed with herbs, spices, dried flowers, even vinegar-soaked sponges. Why? Because they believed disease travelled through bad air, miasma. If it stank, it killed. So they tried to filter death out with lavender and desperation. The cloak, waxed leather, head to toe. Not to look edgy, but to stop infected fluids. Because yes, sometimes people just exploded near you. The cane? Not a walking stick. It was a prodding tool to lift blankets, poke patients, even fend off mobs without getting too close. Because plague wasn't just a disease, it was a riot waiting to happen. And the job? Brutal. You weren't curing people, you were counting them, diagnosing, recording, and, let's be honest, witnessing. You were there to mark houses, supervise quarantine, estimate how long someone had left. Most of your patients didn't survive, and neither did most of your colleagues. People think these doctors were respected. They weren't. They were often second-rate medics or straight-up volunteers. Why take the job? Sometimes for money. Cities offered hazard pay. Sometimes because you owed favours. Sometimes because you had no other options. The risk? Enormous. Imagine walking house to house during a pandemic surrounded by infected families, corpses in the street, and the constant sound of coughing. You lived in the epicenter of doom, hoping your bird mask and pocket of sage would protect you from one of history's deadliest diseases. Spoiler, it usually didn't. And the plague, it wasn't neat. It didn't kill quietly. You started with fever, then chills, then buboes, swellings the size of eggs in your groin, armpits and neck that turned black and oozed. Sometimes your skin rotted, sometimes your lungs filled, sometimes you died within a day. Other times it dragged on for a week while you hallucinated angels and screamed at rats. There was no cure, no antibiotics. Just bleed them, boil them, or rub them with crushed emeralds, which, to be clear, did not work. Plague didn't care about wealth or titles. It hit kings, popes, peasants, everyone. Entire cities emptied. Whole families gone in a week. In some towns, the only people left alive were plague doctors and gravediggers. And when things got bad enough, society broke. Doctors abandoned posts. Priests fled. Parents left children. The social contract crumbled under the weight of death. And what replaced it wasn't justice. It was survival. Yet somehow, the image stuck. That bird mask, that black silhouette, that eerie calm in a world falling apart. 'Cause plague doctors weren't heroes. They were markers, symbols of the moment when civilization held its breath and wondered if this was how it all ended. Not with fire, not with war, but with a knock on the door and a man in a beak. Let's talk about sieges. Not battles, not duels, not brave cavalry charges under sunset skies. We're talking months of boredom punctuated by moments of pure horror. We're talking walls that bleed, food that runs out, and desperation so thick it starts to taste like dust. Because a medieval siege? That wasn't war. That was a slow-motion apocalypse. Imagine this. You live in a city. Stone walls, thick gates, a few towers. You've got food, water, people, maybe even hope. Then one morning you see flags on the horizon, banners you don't recognize, a noble's crest you hoped you'd never see again, and behind them, an army, not charging in, not demanding a duel, just settling in. They pitch tents, dig trenches, start building towers, and you realize they're not leaving. That's the moment a siege begins, not with fire or steel, but with the realization that no help is coming. From that point on, it's a waiting game, and the longer it goes, the worse it gets. The attackers? They've got options. Catapults, trebuchets, giant wooden towers that roll up to your walls like angry buildings. Sometimes they just wait, let starvation do the work. Other times they start launching dead animals over the wall, or worse, diseased corpses. Because siege warfare wasn't about glory. It was psychological terrorism with a side of biological warfare. And inside the city, it's not much better. At first, people try to stay normal, ration food, keep busy, tell stories about how help is surely on the way, but help never comes, and slowly things begin to rot. Food runs low, bread shrinks, meat disappears. Then come the rats, then the dogs, then the horses, and then the rumours about people going missing, and about smoke coming from chimneys that shouldn't have firewood. about neighbours who suddenly look very well fed. Because after enough weeks, enough hunger, enough fear, civilization snaps. There are documented cases, real ones, where people ate plaster off the walls, boiled leather shoes, and yes, eventually, each other. And if you were lucky enough to survive all that, great. Now get ready for the breach, because eventually the walls fall. Sometimes it's a tunnel, sometimes a battering ram, sometimes the gatekeeper got bribed. One way or another, that army outside becomes an army inside. And when that happens, the rules are gone. The first people through the breach, not knights, not diplomats, looters, murderers, men who've been starving, freezing, and promised anything you take is yours. They take everything. Your home gone, your food stolen, your body. A statistic of women, children, elderly, it didn't matter. Cities fell the same way, blood, fire, and screaming. It was called the right of conquest, and it wasn't a bug. It was a feature. And when the dust settled, when the army moved on, all that was left were ashes, graves, and silence. So no, sieges weren't epic. They were slow, brutal lessons in what happens when the system breaks, when hunger wins, and when the people outside the walls stop seeing the people inside them as human. They weren't battles, they were endings. Let's talk about witches. Not broomsticks, not bubbling cauldrons, not pointy hats and cackling laughter under the moon. We're talking about real people, mostly women, dragged from their homes, accused of impossible crimes, tortured until they confessed, and burned in public while the village cheered. Because the witch hunts, they weren't about magic, they were about control. Here's the truth. Medieval and early modern Europe was a pressure cooker. Plague, famine, war, corruption. Life was terrifying and short, and when things went wrong, when the crops failed, when the baby died, when lightning struck the barn, people needed someone to blame. Enter the witch. The idea was simple. If God was good, then evil had to come from somewhere else. And that somewhere lived in your neighbourhood, had a weird mole, didn't come to church, talk to cats. So someone pointed a finger, and that's all it took. Once the accusation was made, you were already halfway in the grave. The trial wasn't about justice. It was a script. You were guilty. The only question was, how long would it take to prove it? They'd strip you naked, shave your body, search for the devil's mark. A freckle, a scar, a birthmark, proof. Then came the torture. You weren't tortured for punishment, you were tortured for truth. They believed pain revealed the soul, so they crushed fingers, dislocated shoulders, stretched limbs until your joints whispered secrets you never meant to tell. If you screamed, guilty. If you didn't, the devil was protecting you, guilty. And once you confessed, they asked you to name others, friends, neighbours, maybe that old woman who gave you tea, maybe your daughter, maybe the midwife who delivered your child, and the cycle spread. Witch hunts weren't isolated, they were contagious. They swept through towns like fire through dry grass. Germany, France, Scotland, Salem. No one was safe. No age limit. No mercy. And here's the twist. Most of the time it had nothing to do with witches. It was land disputes, family grudges, patriarchal panic, a way to silence women who were too outspoken, too strange, too independent. Midwives, herbalists, widows, healers. These were the most common targets. People with knowledge, people who didn't need men, people who reminded the village that power could look different. That was the real fear. Magic wasn't the enemy, autonomy was, so they made it evil. They wrote books, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, guides on how to spot, interrogate and destroy. And the church, the state, they didn't just allow it, they profited from it. Witch trials were public theatre, a warning, a flex. This is what happens when you challenge the system. And the executions, they weren't quick. Hanging was for the lucky ones. Others were burned, slowly, so the lesson would sink in with the smoke. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, died. Not because they flew through the night or cursed the cows, but because they were vulnerable and someone needed a scapegoat. So the next time you see a witch costume, remember, it wasn't fantasy, it was history, and it didn't end in a spell, it ended in fire